Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&As. It is Thursday, pretty early morning, so hopefully everybody had enough time to get their questions in, but let's jump in and see what we got. First up, over on Patreon, Christopher Skurick said about the CRT projector that we talked about last week, they finally have the answer. The Mister has to send RGBHV and not RGBS. So that means that the sync combiner circuit, the passive sync combiner circuit that the Mister uses probably isn't compatible with that projector, which is something I've seen before, and it's not that big of a deal. Worst case scenario, then you would have had to have gotten a cheap Extron RGB interface. You can get those for like 20 bucks if you could make your own PSU, which is even easier. You just got to grab the same voltage PSU, snip the end off, and add the little connector on the end. So glad that you did the troubleshooting steps, though. So now I know what direction to point people in for CRT projectors if they run into this. Just keep it in its original RGBHV, or if you need RGBS, run it through an active sync combiner, or a sync separator, sync combiner, whichever one, depending on your setup, and not a passive one. So thanks for the follow-up. Much appreciated, and I'm really glad you got it working. Next up, the dressing gown wants to know if I have any recommendations for getting PAL consoles and games from NES and Master System up to output at 60 hertz. So this is complicated because not only do you need a hardware mod, but how is the game going to react? And the best example that I know of would be Sonic the Hedgehog. If you take Sonic and you run it on NTSC or NTSCJ consoles, it runs at the speed most people around the world remember it as. But if you play the PAL version, it's just slowed down. It's the same game, it's just running at 50 hertz. So it's slower. The music is slower, the game is slower. And the first time I experienced that was weird. It felt like I was playing a bad emulator almost. I'm sure people in PAL territories are probably upset by me crapping on their original Sonic the Hedgehog experience, but it's my honest opinion on how I felt when I played it. So I imagine that if you're going to do the opposite, if you're going to hardware mod your console to then run at 60 hertz, PAL 50 games would then be running faster. So you could do things like hack the games to keep the original speed, and sometimes that worked, sometimes it didn't. As far as like ROM hackers go, when it comes to the original developers, a lot of the bigger title games were made with two completely different versions, so they do run and feel the same, even if you're playing on a PAL 50 or an NTSC 60 console. So as far as homebrew solutions, there are definitely ways to do that, but that's way out of my scope of understanding, to be honest with you. So what I would just look at is getting a region mod in your console that allows you to play both games, seeing if your console allows for a switch between the frequencies, and then kind of go down to which games have different ROM hacks. I will say, though, many people have gone down this route before, and then by the time they got to the end of it, they realized they could have just bought a second console for far less money. So I think a lot of people in PAL regions might do something like get Japanese consoles, because then you get all of the NTSC library. You know, maybe you would have to mod it or something, but it would be a much easier mod than a 50-60 PAL NTSC mod type of thing. So that's definitely something to consider. Yeah, maybe you might want to just get a 60 hertz console and run ROMs on it. Maybe you're going to want both. I don't know, but I would take the total scenario into account and your total cost and your total goals, especially if you have something like a small dedicated retro station where you couldn't put many consoles in. Maybe having one that does both or just a 60 hertz would be a better option for you. But if you have all the space in the world, then just get a couple of them. It'll probably be cheaper. Next up, Dee wanted to chime in on the conversation from last week about is there lag using an Extron HDMI switch? Because some of the manuals talk about a buffering mode and stuff like that. So how much of a buffer is it? Does it matter? And Dee used a time sleuth, and it was microseconds difference. So using a time sleuth on their LG C1, it was about 2.18 milliseconds, and then going through the Crosspoint 84, it was 2.24 milliseconds. So that is exactly what I would have expected. Either it's exactly the same and your hand just moved just a fraction of a millimeter when you were taking the results, or even if you taped the time sleuth in place or something, it could be adding a couple of microseconds, which is absolutely zero in the context of HDMI devices and gaming and stuff like that. There's no debate about that from anybody. So I would say that based on these tests and some of the other people that I saw chime in the YouTube comments as well, it should be pretty safe to use Extron HDMI switches. I would obviously just look out for the same thing you would look out on all types of HDMI devices. Does it say anything about scaling? Is it a switch that will also scale? If that's the case, it's probably going to add a bunch of latency. But if not, then it should just be zero, essentially. Now, they also just wanted to note that they set the input EDID to 1080p at 60 in the Extron software while testing, and many of the HDMI switchers require special software from Extron to set EDIDs and adjust other settings. So, depending on your use case, that might actually be amazing or a pain. If you have to go in and reset it and then redo each one of the EDIDs, that might be a pain in the butt if you're not used to stuff like that. Hopefully a factory reset would just default them all to 1080p 60 or something. But I actually think this is pretty awesome because then you could set EDIDs on certain devices just so that you're always sending the correct resolutions. This is getting to a bit of a more advanced conversation than does an Extron HDMI switch add lag. So if anybody wants to dig into that, I could do that, but it's more advanced and most people aren't going to need to deal with all of that stuff. But thanks very much for chiming in, D. I appreciate it, and as well as everybody else in the YouTube comments. It's good to know that these things are safe to buy without worrying about adding latency. Next up, Clark Gibson has an Atari 2600 with an RGB mod, but the RGB output jack and the audio output jack are separate. It's not built into one mini DIN or something like that. And they're looking to combine those signals into one SCART cable. And they're hoping to be able to do that externally without any soldering required. And I don't know if any device like that exists. It might be a more expensive piece of equipment or kind of more of a homebrew style thing, but I think this is one of these few cases where you could probably just try to do it yourself because yes, making SCART cables is a massive pain. However, all you would be doing in this case is opening the SCART head and then soldering soldering audio to the left and right pins and ground, and that's it. And you could probably even creatively use one little piece of wire to bridge those two pins together. So you're really just soldering 2.5 wires, I guess you could call it that way. And I think it would be, as far as soldering work goes, fairly easy. Now, if you've not done that before, working inside of a SCART head is a pain, working around other cables is a pain. You could just try to order a custom cable. You can go to see if any of the cable manufacturers have what you're looking for. You could try to contact anybody who sells cables to do that. But also, this is the type of mod that basically any pro modder could do with their eyes closed. And I'm not saying that to insult you, Clark. I'm saying that to give you the confidence to say, if you don't feel comfortable doing it, or if you don't own a soldering iron, don't go out. I mean, this is just my opinion, but don't go out and buy a soldering iron for one job that you're not even really interested in doing anyway. That's the time to send your cable, and maybe even just send the whole thing to somebody who knows what they're doing, who's done it a bunch of times, and who could whip this up in like 5 minutes. This is not one of those things that would be a challenging thing that could ruin your console. It should be pretty easy, and testing is as simple as plug it in, and if you get audio, then it works. I'm wondering though, does Tim, if you have Tim's RGB mod, doesn't Tim sell this exact cable? So it's like a 3.5 millimeter audio jack on one and a 8-pin mini DIN on the other. I mean, that should be available to do that. So I would just kind of look into different cable solutions and maybe even talk to the person who did the mod for you and see if they could either get you another cable or remod it. But as far as this stuff goes, that would be fairly easy. So I guess to swing back to the beginning, if you feel like soldering and doing any kind of minor modding is something you have any interest in whatsoever, I would try to do this yourself. And if not, then don't spend the money on a soldering iron. Just try to pay to have the solution done so you just don't have to worry about it. So hopefully I pointed you in the right direction, but message me if I got that one wrong and you need better advice. Next up, Quantum Guitar just got one of Querdimoto's digital audio mods installed into their Super Nintendo, and it's not working through their receiver, so they're wondering what to do next. Is this expected? They see the red light coming from the output of the mini Toslink connector, so what's going on with this? It could very well be that your receiver just is not compatible. And that's something that I have run into before. It took a while because for a long time, all the equipment that I had was compatible with the SNES digital mod, but I finally had one that wasn't, so I was able to use that for testing. So it is absolutely possible that your receiver just isn't compatible with the weird signal that the SNES outputs. But what I would absolutely do first is double check that there's nothing wrong with the installation. And that is not any kind of shade thrown at your modder. There's a ton of things that could have gone wrong. It could have been working perfectly in their setup, and maybe there was a cold solder joint that popped off in transit. You never know. Things happen. I would just verify on something that it's still working. So look for any other equipment in your house with an optical audio input. Try plugging it in, seeing what you get. Maybe some of your friends have equipment that you could just plug it in to see if it works. And just verify that you're getting output on something and then go from there. And if you try a bunch of different receivers and you're not getting an output, then you would probably want to send that back to your modder and just have them double and triple check it. You could also open it up and do a visual inspection. I mean, if you open it up and take a really nice picture with your cell phone and zoom in and you see a bridge connection or a wire popped off, there's your answer. But I would do the troubleshooting steps like that first. And then if it turns out the thing's completely fine, it's just not compatible with your receiver, then I would go down the road of, okay, do you love your receiver? Is that one that you're keeping, or were you planning on upgrading anyway? And this is the excuse you need. If you're not in a position to upgrade at the moment, maybe you look into an audio resampler, and then you're just going to want to double check and make sure it sounds okay. Does the audio and video stay in sync? Stuff like that. So I would start with just double and triple checking that the mod is still working okay, because just because the light's on doesn't necessarily mean it's working. It just means it's getting power. So I would check all that stuff first and go from there, but hopefully this is an easy issue. And if not, I could look into resamplers and stuff like that and see, but I would personally start with the cheapest one you find on Amazon and go from there. Just because when it comes to stuff like that, I mean, it's also digital audio, so the chances of it adding a ton of interference are way less than analog. So if you happen to find something super cheap that works, cool. And if not, I guess you could always return it. So let me know how you make out with it. Next up, Koala Koa wanted to follow up on the issue they were having with their Sega Saturn not working through their Extron Crosspoint. And there were two issues here. One I thought I guessed the answer to, and the other one I'm still kind of baffled at. But the SCART cable that wasn't working must be a Sync on Luma SCART cable. So I know Retro Gaming Cables stopped making the C-Sync version for a while, so I needed to update the links on my website because I think I had them still listed as that when they were actually Sync on Luma. So I'll make sure to fix those links on the website. But that makes sense to me because the Crosspoints require pure C-Sync. You can't have any other signal running through the H-Sync line of Extron equipment. So you would either need to just get a C-Sync cable, or you would need to have some kind of sync stripper circuit, which isn't at all necessary on the Saturn. Just get the other cable that you need. So that part's fine. The one part that did confuse me was, why isn't the component video cable working from Retro Gaming Cables? So my guess, this is total guess, is that it got damaged in shipping, because that had shipped around a couple of times. I'd let different people borrow it. So that thing could have just been busted up from being abused and being shipped all over the place. So that was the weirdest part for me. The SCART cable not working, that in my head, I was like, oh, it's probably a Sync on Luma cable. But when two wouldn't work through the Crosspoint, that's when I thought something was up. So I'll recheck all of those and just to make sure, but I'm pretty sure that was all the issue was. So if you're wondering about that, yes, you could run Saturns through a Crosspoint with no issue. And thank you again to everybody who chimed in the comments confirming that that works in your setup as well. I don't think I had time to respond to all of them, but I did read them all, and that was really helpful in our troubleshooting because I was able to just say, oh, hey, a bunch of people are confirming this works perfect for them, and it did work fine for me too. I think with the exact cable that I let Koala borrow to test this. So I don't know what the issue was. I'm assuming just damaged in shipping then. So thank you for everybody for the help, and at least we got you back on track, Koala. Next up, Bamboo Shadow wants to know if I'll be doing a review on the manual SCART 621 switch by Retro Gaming Cables. If Rob sends me one, I'll gladly do a live stream checking it out, but it should be exactly like the other switch that he made that I did do a very deep dive test on, and I loved. I called it my favorite of all the cheaper switches out there, and it still is, actually. And in fact, this one should be the same in every way, except rather than being designed to plug directly into the Tink 5X, you could just have a normal SCART input on there. So I don't like giving strong recommendations for something I haven't personally tested, but I can't imagine that there's going to be a problem with this because it's based on the same exact design. There's only been two minor changes to it, the location and the socket for the SCART input. So my gut's telling me this is a perfectly safe buy, and it's probably going to work absolutely perfect in your setup at a really good price. So if Rob wants to send me one of the newer ones to test, I'll happily do that. But honestly, I think this is one of those rare moments where it's so close to the same thing that you could just buy it confidently and know that you're not going to have any issues. I'll leave a link to the other review that I did, and definitely check that out if you're interested. See all the methods that I used to test it, and hopefully that would be enough just to solidify the purchase for you, knowing that it's very small chance that something's going to be different in a negative way on the newer Switch. Next up, Demon Koo wants to talk magnetically shielded speakers again. They have a 5.1 setup, and they just put the speakers in the corner of the room because it works for the apartment and it seems to be far enough away from all the CRTs. They moved the center channel slightly farther away from the TV than it was, well past double the distance from the interference. That's good. So what about subwoofers, though? I did recommend that test of having the camera pointed at the CRT and moving the subwoofer around, but do I have any distancing recommendations for that? No, it's just the same as the rest. And I just also want to stress, like I always do, this is not a scientific method. This is the Bob guess. But I have talked to people far smarter than me, all of which seem to think that this is a perfectly reasonable way to test for any kind of interference and potential damage to a CRT. Because what you really have to worry about is long-term damage. So if you have a non-magnetically shielded speaker next to your CRT and you have a purple tint and you leave it there for years, that could permanently damage that thing. Whereas if you do the camera test where basically you set your camera to manual mode, even your cell phone, just make sure you lock the settings and then leave it on an all white screen and then walk by with a subwoofer and put it in its location, see where the interference is, and also check the first picture versus the last picture in that video to see if, even though it might look like it's still an all white screen, is it discolored towards the end of that video? I would actually check a couple of frames of the video to make sure, because the way the CRT's beam works, maybe one picture might look darker than the other. So just do a basic comparison. But if you're not seeing any interference, I wouldn't really worry about it. I would just do that walk by test. So that way you could see, as you're walking by, does it get all crazy colors and then disappear? Was it never on there in the first place? So that way you could kind of see with your own eyes. And it's also one of those things too, where if you put the subwoofer down and there's interference, nothing right when it drops to the ground, it's still probably a little too close. But if you get all the way to where your subwoofer is and there hasn't been interference on your screen for a foot or two, then you should be totally fine. So once again, those are my guesses. Those are not scientific readings or anything like that, but it's worked for me, and it's been verified by people smarter than me that should be a safe way to go about doing it. And if it's ever something that really bothers you, like what if you spend $1 gazillion on the rarest BVM in the world? Just buy magnetically shielded speakers. And if not, then if you're just talking about normal CRTs, I would be confident doing it this way. Next up, PS3 Inquisition has a Sega CDX with a 32X, and they just got a RetroTink 4K. And now with the higher resolution, they're able to see issues that they weren't able to notice as much before, which makes sense because when you scale an analog video signal, you scale everything that goes with it, including analog noise, interference, all of that other stuff. So the issue is that the video output is extremely noisy, and there's also a background hum that gets louder depending on what's on screen. And they tried 2 different sets of HD Retrovision cables, and there was no difference. So I would try a couple of different things just to verify. First, take off the 32X and just try with the CDX. And how does the problem change? Is it much better? Is it much worse? Is it the exact same? If it's the exact same, the problem is then in your CDX, not the 32X. If the problems completely go away, now you know the problem's in the 32X or maybe the connector cables that you're using with it or something. So your next troubleshooting steps will be based on that. If it's the 32X, check the link cable that you're using. Make sure you got Retro Access was selling really nice angled ones for a while. I don't know whatever happened with that, but those were cool. Those were definitely the ones that I used on it, and I didn't get any interference. If not, you could just use any shielded one. Don't get one of the Amazon ones. Get one from a reputable seller that's making them shielded so that you don't get issues like this. And if your 32X is still having issues, maybe that is going to need some work, but those also aren't the most well-built devices. I've been calling them the mushroom turd forever for a reason. I've always had issues with them. So if it's your 32X, maybe leave it off and only plug it in when you need it. And at the very least, try troubleshooting the cables and stuff like that. If the problem is your CDX, it could be many different things. Like you could just need a recap, but you also could have issues with the audio circuit. That audio comparison video I posted over 10 years ago now, that was a CDX that had audio issues. And people get really upset with me for that because they're like, no, CDXs don't sound like that. I think I was very clear in the video that my CDX absolutely did. And it may not have been just how they all sounded. There might have been a problem with the audio, but I've absolutely heard other people have issues with their CDX. So you would want to send that to somebody who has experience with it. Cruz has done mine, so I don't know if he's still taking on new work. I know he's very busy, but you might want to reach out to him and see. But if the problem is traced down to the CDX, yes, a recap, putting a piece of tape under the spindle to protect the motherboard, and just overall checking out the circuits and making sure. Running MD4A, running some 240p test suite tests. Somebody who's got experience with the CDX will probably have done all that anyway if you send it to him for a recap. But that's the next step in that. So determine if the problem is the CDX or the 32X, and then kind of choose where you go from there. And maybe follow up if you don't mind, because I'm just kind of curious what the issue actually is and what the fix would be. Next up, Tony also has an Extron DXP HDMI switch, and even though they didn't have a time sleuth, they did the whole split to a CRT thing to check, and it looks like with and without the Extron switch plugged in, there's no latency. So this is great because we had somebody before test with a time sleuth, and now somebody tested with the CRT, and this is the type of nerd stuff that I love. You're verifying each other's results without even knowing it and getting the same conclusion. This is the type of stuff I love doing, and that's why you'll always see me test stuff even if other people have tested it, because what's the worst that could happen? I verify somebody's correct results, so I love it. So thank you very much for chiming in, Tony. 2 different ways to confirm the same thing. It looks like those Extron DXP HDMI matrix switches do not add lag, and it looks like they get up to 1920 by 1260 max. So that's pretty good. That should be a decent choice for most situations, especially if you're dealing with retro gaming equipment, because your average retro equipment isn't going to go past that anyway. So awesome. Thanks, Tony. Next up, a couple of questions from Charles Madeir. First, why do some VGA cables work with RGBS but not RGBHV, and others work with RGBHV and not RGBS? So that's kind of an easy and hard thing to answer. First of all, you never know how these cables are being made. They're supposed to pass, at the very least, red, green, blue, horizontal sync and vertical sync and grounds through that cable. And if nothing else, that's the goal of a VGA cable, no matter what. However, sometimes I've seen cables that share grounds. Some of them don't have proper shielding. So one well-built VGA cable would work fine, but one that doesn't work might cause issues with RGBS because maybe it's also sending some sort of signal accidentally over the vertical sync line, and whatever your target device is detecting something, even though it might just be interference because it's not shielded, or maybe the ground is looped through. So in that case, your device thinks that there could be horizontal or a vertical sync being sent, even though it's really only on the horizontal side. Why it wouldn't work with RGBHV, that's the bad cable, to be honest. There should not be a VGA cable made that doesn't work with that, unless you're very specifically talking about SCART or VGA to SCART cables, because then you would either want a sync combiner circuit built in or only horizontal sync passed. It's kind of what the HD15 to SCART is. So The short answer is because the cable's not built right. That was the longer, more detailed answer in case you were curious about that. And also, you're talking about using Extron RGB interfaces. So those are devices that can take different types of sync and convert them to whatever you would like. So that would be the perfect scenario in which maybe the Extron's reading the H sync, but also has some kind of detection going on and there's some interference that's messing with the vertical side. So I would definitely just buy a different cable and hopefully that would fix it. The next question, where did that go? There's a second question here. I looked right past it. Okay. Do I happen to know what the Extron RGB 160Xi does in regards to TTL? It will output that. So regardless of what your input signal is, it's going to output RGBS at the higher TTL level sync. It should be able to accept a multitude of them on the input side. So if you're switching between RGBHV, RGBS, 75 ohm direct TTL, it should accept all of those. 75 ohm sync is always iffy with Extron equipment though. It might not just accept that over the D sub input on there, but it's always going to output TTL level on the output side. So if you're taking one of those boxes and going into SCART equipment, you're definitely going to need a resistor to attenuate it. If you're going to anything with a D sub connector that's not a homebrew hack, then it should be completely safe, or a monitor with BNC connectors and stuff like that. Always double check your service manuals. You don't want to ruin a monitor because you sent the wrong voltage sync through it. But generally speaking, they're designed to have all of these different voltages run through them. Some have switches for attenuation. Some just automatically do it. But I think that basically sums it up. But if I missed something, please let me know. And hopefully I could help clarify. Couple of questions from Jason Guffey. First, what's up with Voultar's 2-chip SNES mod? I heard he flooded his own basement just to cover up the fact that it was fake and never existed in the first place. Next up, they got a couple of different HDMI cables on Amazon, and they weren't one of the community vetted ones, but they were cheap, so they figured they would try them out anyway. And now the weight of them is causing it to droop and sag in the back of their inputs, and now you get flickery video sometimes. So what to do? Personally, if you've already bought the cables and they're working, I would have some kind of cable strain relief to make sure that they don't droop and put pressure. Zip ties, tape, whatever you want to do. This is one of the many reasons why I buy and test some of this stuff for this exact scenario. The only cable I have that's heavy like that was one that I ran across the ceiling for the projector I used to have, and I did exactly that. I made sure there was strain relief so that it wasn't putting pressure on the pins. Other than that, I would just use regular cables, and if you want to keep those, just important to always have strain relief. I definitely wouldn't use thinner, shorter cables in a signal repeater when you could accomplish that with a thicker cable. If that still doesn't work, you could use like an optical HDMI cable, which are very expensive, but you can get incredibly long runs and they're not nearly as thick and heavy. So I think strain relief is probably the best answer. And next, a coworker recently bought a variable power supply off of Amazon, and while setting the voltage to whatever you'd want is cool, it seems like the amperage output is determined by the load attached rather than something that you set yourself, but there is an amp dial on it. Yeah, so that is where you start to get into more complicated stuff about power. The length of the DC cable, the thickness of the DC cable, how much load is put on it, how much resistance is on the load, all of those things will change voltage, amperage, and all of that. And that's why I never recommend using a benchtop power supply unless you have a general understanding of what any of that stuff is. And that's not an insult, by the way. This is my general opinion on that, talking to everybody who's listening. I'm just saying, when you get into power, things start to get weird very, very quickly. So if you need a variable power supply because you're constantly messing with lots of other things or arcade boards or whatever else, then cool. But for the average person listening to this right now, you would be far better off buying a 5 volt, a 9 volt, and a 12 volt triad and a couple of barrel connector adapters and just using it that way. And all you would need to verify at that point is the physical fit of the barrel adapter voltage and polarity. And that you could just use a basic multimeter to test. Even if you don't have any information, you could always pop the case off of whatever it is that you're testing and test to see which of either the center pin or the outer pin goes to ground, and then just poke around at the board for any other ground point. So that's as basic as it gets for that stuff. The only thing you would want to worry about is not under amping anything, but get a high amp triad and you should be fine for most of this stuff. So if you're really interested, you could probably find some videos. Maybe EEV blog guy has one on that, and you could do a deep dive if you're really interested. But overall, I would just stay away from that stuff unless you really needed it, because why introduce a piece of equipment into your setup that could cause more harm than good, unless you need it for whatever else that you're doing. Also, all kidding aside, Voultar got hit with the same problem that a lot of my friends got hit with. And they were all told that their products were shipping right before the factory shut down for New Year. And don't worry, we'll make sure to get it out before the end of the week. And they never shipped. And that wasn't just Voultar. I knew at least 3 other people who had the exact same thing happen from different manufacturers. And then when they come back from vacation, they need to ramp up their business again. They need to get their highest paying, highest volume customers out the door first. So it's not like, oh, they're back in on Monday, so my stuff will ship on Wednesday. It's probably weeks to come back and catch up with all the smaller orders. Because remember, a lot of these bigger factories make orders in the quantities of 10,000, 50,000, 100,000. So small retro gaming orders aren't really a blip on their radar. So that's what happened. And I don't think, if they arrive, which they should be arriving anytime soon, I think he's going to still try to get those, try to get that tested and start accepting mods from people for that. But the boards themselves, as soon as they arrive, I'll have some info on it. I just don't know what the basement flood delay is going to be from the time they arrive to when he's going to be able to start taking mods to when he's going to just release them publicly. Because you and everybody else listening are welcome to disagree, but I actually think he's doing the right thing by saying, I'm starting out doing these install only just to triple check the work, and then I'll just release them for everybody else to install. There's a lot of really angry people who full and wholeheartedly disagree with that. It's fine. It's not your product, so you can get as angry as you want. What are you gonna do about it? I think it was the right move though, because the last thing you want is to spend years of your life trying to make a mod that accomplishes a problem that needs to be fixed, just to find out you missed one revision from one region. So I think he's doing the right thing. I just don't know what the delay would be now. So. I also don't understand why so many of these companies just lied and said, oh, yeah, your boards are done. We'll get them out before. Why didn't honesty would have been so much better if they were just like, hey, we're shutting down. We had to get larger orders out. We're sorry. We'll pick you up when we get back. It's going to be delayed about a month. That's annoying, but then you just tell your customers and then everybody's happy. The problem is when your customers are like, Voultar didn't take pre-orders, by the way, but the problem is in situations where somebody took pre-orders and they're like, yes, they're definitely going to be here on March 15th. And then March 15th rolls around and they got nothing. And then people start to get freaked out. That could all have been mitigated if some of these manufacturers were just like, hey, look, we were at a mad dash to finish. We didn't get to you. We'll get to you as soon as we get back. I don't know anybody who works with Chinese manufacturing that isn't already used to stuff like that around New Year. So honesty would have been better in that scenario. But anyway, hopefully I was able to at least just explain it through. And I'm looking forward to seeing these things hit the wild, because I have a feeling people are going to be pleasantly surprised with the final revision. Well, that's it for this week. All the questions this week just happen to be on Patreon, because that's where most people support through, but these are for everybody who supports in any way. These Q&As are just a small thank you to everybody who keeps RetroRGB going. So anywhere that you support, please ask any question that you have. Just please do it in the latest Q&A post, because the way the services work, I can't really figure out what's a new question on an older post. Plus, as you saw here today, I like just scrolling through in real time and having a conversation as if we were all hanging out at a bar or coffee shop or expo somewhere. So as always, thank you to everybody who participates, and especially thank you to people who support in any way. I really appreciate it. So we'll see you next week.